Have you ever wondered, what stories do those tattered uniforms stained with mudblood and gunpowder tell about the history of America? From the militiamen in coarse cloth at Lexington to the paratroopers of World War II with their heavy steel helmets, and even the warriors in desert camouflage of modern wars. Every stitch, every shade of fabric stands as a witness to sacrifice, suffering, and the pursuit of freedom. Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. Today we will embark on a journey of nearly 250 years following the evolution of military uniforms to uncover how they not only shielded the soldier's body, but also reflected the very soul of a nation in war and in peace. Before there was a United States Army, before the banners of a nation flew above disciplined lines of soldiers, there were farmers with pitchforks, craftsmen with muskets, and merchants who left their shops behind to take up arms. They called them militiamen, or more famously the Minutemen, ordinary men who swore to be ready for battle in 60 seconds or less. It was they who fired the opening shots at Lexington and Concord in April 1775, those thunderclaps that echoed across the Atlantic world as the first sparks of the American Revolution. On one side stood the British regulars, red-coated veterans of Europe's battlefields, drilled to perfection and moving like a single machine. On the other side were townsfolk clothed in mismatched garments, some in leather aprons, others in homespun wool, some still smelling of smoke from their hearths. The contrast was jarring. To the British, these rebels were nothing more than an undisciplined rabble, a mob too wild to face professional soldiers. Yet the rebels knew the ground, the woods, the farms, and they carried not only their muskets, but the conviction that they were fighting for their homes, their families, and their rights. The early American fighters were not outfitted in uniform. There was no standard coat or hat, no gleaming buttons, no polished boots that marked them as soldiers. Instead, there was a patchwork of civilian clothing, making it almost impossible to distinguish between the combatant and the bystander. This made them unpredictable, and to the British, infuriating. The very lack of a uniform mirrored the political reality of the colonies themselves. 13 separate entities, uncoordinated yet suddenly united by necessity. The first American regulars, when they began to coalesce, carried muskets much like their European counterparts. Smoothbore, inaccurate, beyond short range, these weapons belched smoke and thunder, but often missed their target. Battles were won by volleys of massed fire and the willingness to stand firm in a line as musket balls tore the air around you. But here lay the Americans' weakness. They lacked not only training, but the very structure of an army. There was no permanent institution, no deep tradition of discipline like the British regiments whose roots stretched back centuries. What they had was spirit, but spirit alone cannot withstand the brutal grind of war. That is why the early months of the Revolution were as chaotic as they were inspiring. Farmers turned soldiers fought with incredible courage at Lexington and Concord, sending the British reeling back toward Boston under a constant hail of gunfire from behind walls and trees. Yet when the fighting shifted into pitched battles such as at Bunker Hill, the Americans often broke under pressure. They could inflict heavy casualties, yes, but they could not yet stand like a professional force. And still, this mattered more than the tactical outcome. The sight of American citizens facing down the mighty British Empire sent shockwaves across the colonies. Pamphlets spread the word. Tavern whispers became roars of defiance. A legend was being born of a people willing to fight the strongest army in the world with nothing but resolve muskets and their ordinary clothes on their backs. It is hard to imagine today, in an age where military uniforms are symbols of power and authority, that the first soldiers of the United States had no such attire. But that very absence carried meaning. They fought not as representatives of a standing government which did not yet exist, but as guardians of their towns and families. They looked like their neighbors because they were their neighbors. Yet even in those chaotic days, something more enduring was forming. Behind the ragged militias, Congress debated generals were appointed, and slowly an army, the Continental Army, began to take shape. It was fragile, often underfed, often unpaid, but it was an army nonetheless, a thread of continuity binding the disparate colonies together. The early soldiers began to distinguish themselves with improvised badges, hunting shirts or cockades in their hats. These small marks carried significance, a sign of belonging, of shared purpose. Soldiers craved recognition, the sense that they were part of something larger than themselves. In those small gestures of unity lay the seeds of what would become the American military tradition. And if muskets and powder were their tools, then ideals were their ammunition. The Declaration of Independence was still a year away, but already the men who marched and fought in 1775 carried within them the radical thought that they were not simply resisting taxes or unfair treatment, they were defending a vision of self-rule. This was what gave them courage to face an enemy whose officers dismissed them as a scum of the earth whose bayonets gleamed with the threat of annihilation. The uniformity they lacked in clothing, they found in conviction. Still, the truth must be told, America's war for independence would not be won by enthusiasm alone. Muskets' misfired militia units melted away when their short enlistments ended and desertion was rife. Without discipline, the revolution could have collapsed under the weight of its own disorganization. The militias were a beginning, but they could not be the end. And so, as the revolution unfolded, the cry went out for something new. For the colonies to truly stand as one, they would need more than brave citizens firing from behind stone walls. They would need to forge a professional army, an institution capable of meeting the British regulars on equal ground. This is where the story begins to shift, from chaos into order, from farmers into soldiers, from patchwork into a uniformed force that would soon march in step muskets on their shoulders, banners snapping in the wind, no longer just a collection of individuals, but the embryo of a nation's army. But before they reached that point, before they stood victorious at Saratoga or Yorktown, before they marched under their own eagle standards, they would endure the crucible of suffering and transformation at a place called Valley Forge. That frozen camp in the Pennsylvania woods would test their endurance, strip away illusions, and forge them into something new. It would take the hand of a foreigner, a stern Prussian drill master, to give shape to the spirit that already burned in their hearts. And so, from the smoke of Lexington, from the ragged bravery of Concord, from the blood on the slopes of Bunker Hill, the first steps had been taken. The uniforms had not yet arrived, but the soul of an army and of a nation was already marching forward. By the winter of 1777, the promise of revolution seemed close to breaking. The Continental Army, such as it was, limped into a frozen valley north of Philadelphia. The name of that place would forever be etched into American Memory Valley Forge. There, surrounded by snow and skeletal trees, thousands of men made camp in crude wooden huts. Their clothing was threadbare. Some marched barefoot, their footprints staining the snow red with blood. Frostbite and starvation stalked them like wolves. Disease cut down more soldiers than enemy bullets ever had. At night, the smoke from campfires mixed with the groans of the sick rising into the cold Pennsylvania sky. This was no army in the European sense. It was a desperate collection of men trying to survive the winter. Rations failed to arrive, supplies were stolen or lost, and morale hovered on the edge of collapse. Even General George Washington, who had stood resolute through setbacks before, feared that the revolution might crumble not on the battlefield, but in the silence of hunger and despair. And yet, Valley Forge became the furnace where a true army was forged. For into that camp rode a man who seemed at first glance out of place, Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben. A former officer of the Prussian army, von Steuben carried with him the knowledge of Europe's most disciplined military machine. He spoke little English, his commands often translated by aides, but his bearing spoke volumes. He carried himself like a soldier who had stood in ranks that did not break, whose voice could cut through chaos like a blade. Washington, desperate for order, gave von Steuben free rein, and so began one of the most remarkable transformations in military history. Every morning, von Steuben would select a small group of men and drill them relentlessly. He corrected every detail, the way a musket was held, the speed at which powder was rammed down the barrel, the posture of a soldier at attention. He swore in German and French, in every language he knew, cursing their mistakes with fiery passion. But behind the sternness was purpose. His model company would learn discipline and then teach it to the others, rippling outward until the entire army moved as one. The soldiers grumbled, cursed him back, laughed at his foreign words. But slowly a change came. The ragged lines that once stumbled through maneuvers began to march with precision. Men who had been farmers only months earlier learned to load and fire their muskets and practice rhythm volley by volley as deadly and steady as the European regiments they faced. And with this training came something more than just skill confidence. The men of Valley Forge no longer looked like a mob. They began to look and feel like an army. Their uniforms were still makeshift, their coats patched and colors mismatched, but their movements were synchronized. For the first time, they believed they could stand in an open field against the red-coated professionals and not scatter. It was during these cold months that the Continental Army truly became American. The blue coats that slowly emerged as the dominant uniform color took inspiration from European fashion, but carried a meaning beyond cloth. Blue was not the scarlet of kings nor the white of empires. It was something new, a color chosen to represent the colonies, to unite them in a common cause. From Valley Forge, the army marched not as an unformed mass, but as a disciplined force. At Monmouth in 1778, they held their ground in blistering heat, standing toe-to-toe with British regulars and proving the transformation was real. From there, victories at Saratoga, Kings Mountain, and ultimately Yorktown followed until the impossible dream of independence became reality. Von Steuben's influence extended far beyond drills. He introduced a system of manual, simplified training methods that could be passed on quickly, ensuring the new army could replicate his lessons without him present. His Blue Book, as it came to be known, would guide American soldiers for generations. But the story of Valley Forge is not only about technique and training, it is about endurance. These men, clothed in tatters, hungry and cold, could have walked away. Many had no pay waiting for them, no assurance their families would be fed in their absence. Yet they stayed. They endured the starvation, the illness, the biting cold. They endured the fear that the revolution might fail and leave them branded as traitors. Why? Because by then the cause had taken root deeper than material reward. They were no longer simply defending their homes. They were defending the very idea of a nation not yet born. When we look back at Valley Forge, it is tempting to see only suffering. But in truth, it was the crucible of transformation. It was the place where ragged militias became soldiers, where scattered colonies began to see themselves as one people, one army marching toward a shared destiny. In the quiet between drills, soldiers sang songs to keep their spirits alive. They carved initials into their huts, leaving traces of their presence for history to find. And when the ice finally thawed, when the snow melted into muddy fields, they marched out of Valley Forge with muskets on their shoulders, their steps in rhythm, their spirits hardened. This was no longer the patchwork of Lexington and Concord. This was the beginning of an institution that would grow, adapt, and endure for centuries, the United States Army. And as they marched their blue coats catching the sunlight, the officers at their sides still carried saber symbols of authority inherited from European tradition. But in the hands of Americans, those sabers began to take on new forms. Their hilts were often crafted in the shape of an eagle's head, a creature native to the continent, fierce and untamed. Slowly, the eagle spread its wings across banner standards and weaponry, until it became the enduring emblem of American identity. Valley Forge gave the soldiers discipline. The eagle gave them pride. Together, they forged the foundation of an army and of a nation. The revolution was far from over. Hard battles lay ahead. But after Valley Forge, after von Steuben, after the hunger and the drills and the bitter cold, America no longer fought as scattered bands of farmers. It fought as an army, and that made all the difference. By the late 1770s, the American fighting force had changed beyond recognition. Where once a man carried whatever weapon he could find, a fowling piece, an old musket, even farm tools converted for war, now the Continental Army was beginning to standardize. Yet amid the growing discipline, one unit stood apart, carrying weapons unlike any others: Morgan's riflemen. Led by the grizzled frontiersman Daniel Morgan, these men came from the backwoods of Virginia and Pennsylvania, hunters and trackers who were as comfortable stalking deer as they were enemy scouts. They carried not smoothbore muskets, but true rifles, weapons with grooved barrels that imparted a spin on the ball, greatly increasing range and accuracy. While a musket was lucky to hit a man at 80 yards, a rifle in skilled hands could pick off an officer at 200. On the battlefield, this difference was revolutionary. Where British troops advanced in lines expecting to exchange volleys of musket fire, Morgan's riflemen took to the edges of woods and hills. They struck with deadly precision, targeting officers and drummers, the very men who gave orders and kept the redcoats in formation. It was an unorthodox, almost scandalous tactic by European standards, but it struck fear into British ranks. There was something almost poetic about it, America, a land of vast forests and rugged frontiers, producing men whose very weapons embodied the spirit of the wilderness. These rifles were slow to load, yes, but they were perfect for a people who prized independence and skill. Where the musket was a weapon of massed ranks, the rifle was the weapon of the individual, accurate, self-reliant, deadly. Even as the Army adopted more traditional drills, it never lost this dual identity. The disciplined, blue-coated ranks taught by von Steuben gave the Americans credibility on the world stage. But the riflemen reminded everyone, friend and foe alike, that this was not Europe. This was something new, a blend of old-world precision and new-world ingenuity. And as the war dragged on, another symbol began to emerge. If discipline gave the Americans order, then the bald eagle gave them soul. The eagle was not chosen by accident. Fierce native to the continent and soaring higher than any other bird, it embodied the independence and strength the revolutionaries sought. Officers began to carry sabers with pommels shaped like eagles' heads. On banners and standards, the bird spread its wings, representing freedom and vigilance. Soldiers who once had no uniform now marched under a symbol that was theirs alone, unlike the lions and crowns of Europe. For the men in the ranks, the eagle became more than decoration. It was a reminder that they were fighting for something larger than their farms or towns. They were fighting for an identity that set them apart from the empires across the ocean. It is easy, centuries later, to forget how fragile that identity was. The colonies were diverse, from Puritan New Englanders to German settlers in Pennsylvania, from Southern planters to backwoods farmers. Many had little in common. And yet, when they put on the blue coats of the Continental Army, when they marched under Eagle standards, they began to see themselves as Americans. Uniforms in this sense were never just clothing, they were statements. To wear a blue coat was to proclaim allegiance not just to Washington's army, but to the very idea of an independent republic. It was fabric stitched into nationhood. And officers too knew the power of image. Their sabers and sashes set them apart not merely as leaders, but as representatives of order amid chaos. Where the rank and file had their muskets and rifles, the officer's blade gleamed as a symbol of authority and sacrifice. Many of these sabers, adorned with eagle motifs, are preserved today in museums, silent relics of a time when the very shape of a weapon was chosen to inspire men in battle. As the Revolution wore on, victories such as Saratoga gave the Americans more than just tactical success. They gave them legitimacy. Foreign powers like France began to see them not as rebels, but as a potential nation. And much of that shift rested on perception, the sight of disciplined soldiers in uniform, marching under banners, wielding weapons with skill and courage. But identity came at a price. For every Morgan's rifleman picking off a British officer, there were hundreds of militiamen who still lacked shoes, coats, or even food. The Continental Army never fully escaped shortages. Men marched in patched clothing, slept on frozen ground, and endured years of sacrifice. The uniform became in some ways a badge of hardship as much as pride. There is something profoundly human in this contrast. The grandeur of symbols, the eagle, the saber, the blue coat set against the daily misery of hunger and cold. Yet perhaps that is why those symbols mattered so much. They reminded the soldiers that they were part of something enduring, something worth the suffering. In time, these soldiers would march all the way to Yorktown, where British General Cornwallis surrendered in 1781. There, under the banners of eagles and stars, the Americans proved that a ragtag collection of colonies had become a nation and that its army, once clothed in rags, now stood victorious among the armies of the world. Looking back, it is striking how much of this identity was bound up in uniforms and weapons. To modern eyes, a coat or a saber may seem like simple artifacts, but for those soldiers, they were the outward signs of belonging, the tangible proof that they were more than individuals, they were Americans. And this would not end with the Revolution. As the new republic grew, expanded, and faced new challenges, its army would continue to evolve. The blue coat remained, but in time, the headgear would change. The saber would give way to new weapons. And as America entered the 19th century, its soldiers would find themselves tested once again, this time not against foreign empires, but against one another. The Revolution had forged identity. The Civil War would test it to the breaking point. The Revolution had ended, but the story of the American soldier had only just begun. With independence secured, the United States now faced the long, uncertain road of becoming a nation. And as America expanded westward, pushing across rivers and mountains into lands once held by Spain, Britain, and countless native nations, its army too was forced to adapt. By the 1840s, the United States stood on the brink of its first great foreign conflict, the Mexican-American War. The clash was born of ambition and expansionism. Manifest destiny made flesh and blood. When the cannons roared and the armies marched south, the American soldier bore a look both familiar and new. At the siege of Fort Texas in 1846, defenders wore uniforms that still carried the dominant blue that had defined the Revolution. But the details had shifted. Gone were the tall and ornate shakos of European style, which had once towered over soldiers' heads like stovepipes. In their place, a more practical headwear emerged, the visor cap lower, simpler, and far easier to wear in the harsh heat of Mexico. It was the beginning of a long American trend, shedding pomp for practicality. The war was fought not only with muskets, but with artillery and bayonets, and it became a proving ground for many officers who would later make their names in the Civil War. Men like Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee took their first steps into history here, wearing blue coats beneath the blazing Mexican sun. For the ordinary soldier, though, the uniform was still as much a burden as a badge. Wool itched and stifled in tropical climates. Shoes wore thin, marching across dusty plains. The blue coat was a symbol, but it was also a furnace in summer. Yet America prevailed. From Palo Alto to Chapultepec, U.S. forces marched into the heart of Mexico City. And in that victory, the nation gained vast territories, California, Texas, New Mexico, that would shape its destiny. But the war also left scars. It exposed divisions within the young republic, divisions over expansion, slavery, and identity. And soon, those divisions would tear the nation apart. When the first shots of the Civil War rang out in 1861, America once again found itself fighting itself. Brother against brother, father against son. And uniforms once again became markers of identity, but now of two rival nations. The Union Army, or Federals, retained the tradition of blue. Soldiers marched in dark blue tunics with lighter sky blue trousers and wore kepi, short-brimmed caps borrowed from French design. The kepi, with its neat, compact form, replaced the bulkier hats of earlier decades and became one of the most recognizable images of the Civil War soldier. For the Union, this look was more than clothing. It was a deliberate continuation of the revolutionary legacy. Blue meant loyalty to the Republic, loyalty to the flag of the United States. Across the lines, the Confederacy clothed itself in gray and butternut brown colors, chosen partly for practicality, partly for distinction. The South had fewer resources, fewer factories, and fewer supplies. Many Confederate soldiers began the war in mismatched clothing. Their coats dyed with local plants, their buttons hammered together in makeshift shops. Some carried outdated muskets from earlier wars, while others bore shotguns and hunting rifles. The Confederate gray was not always uniform. It was often a patchwork of earthy tones. But it became like Union blue, a symbol. To wear gray was to declare loyalty to a new breakaway nation, one that would fight to preserve its way of life built tragically on slavery. On the battlefield, the contrast was stark lines of blue and gray colliding in thunderous volleys, bayonets flashing in the smoke, but uniforms were more than a means of telling friend from foe. They carried the very weight of ideology. To a Union soldier, the blue coat was not just fabric. It was the living memory of the Revolution, the pledge that the Union must endure. To a Confederate, the gray was defiance, a rejection of federal authority, an oath to fight for one's state, one's home, one's conception of liberty. It is haunting to imagine men who once shared the same flag now staring each other down across the fields of Antietam or Gettysburg, each convinced that their uniform bore the true legacy of America. Even within the Union, not every regiment looked the same. Some units opted for entirely different attire, either from tradition or from the flamboyance of their leaders. Nowhere was this more evident than in the Zouave regiments, whose uniforms were borrowed from the French light infantry units in North Africa. Inspired by the French colonial troops, Zouaves wore baggy trousers, short open jackets, bright sashes, and fezes or turbans. They looked like something out of another world, striding into the smoke of battle in scarlet and blue. The most famous of these flamboyant leaders was Elmer E. Ellsworth, a young officer from Illinois who had founded a drill company known as the Chicago Zouaves. His men dazzled crowds with their acrobatics and precision marching, dressed in the bright garb of their French namesakes. When the Civil War began, Ellsworth led one of the first Zouave regiments. The 11th New York Infantry, nicknamed the Fire Zouaves because many of its men had been New York City firefighters. Ellsworth's fate was tragic and symbolic. In May 1861, while pulling down a Confederate flag from a hotel in Alexandria, Virginia, he was shot and killed, becoming one of the first Union officers to die in the war. His flamboyant uniform, drenched in his blood, became a rallying symbol across the North. The Zouaves may have looked theatrical, but they fought with ferocity on both sides of the conflict. Their exotic uniforms clashed with the mud and smoke of American battlefields, but they left a mark on memory, a reminder that war was not only about death, but also about identity, style, and the ways men chose to present themselves in the face of it. As the war dragged on, practicality triumphed over flair. Bright uniforms faded to duller shades. Cloth wore thin. Soldiers patched their coats with whatever scraps they could find. What mattered was not the cut of a jacket, but the endurance of the man wearing it. And yet, even in rags, the color of the cloth, blue or gray, remained a badge of loyalty, dividing a single people into two warring nations. By the time the war ended in 1865, hundreds of thousands of men lay dead, and America itself was forever changed. The blue uniforms of Union soldiers had prevailed, but at terrible cost. The gray coats of the Confederacy were folded into history, their cause defeated. Yet the memory of both uniforms endures, stitched into the fabric of America's story symbols of unity, division, and the price of war. The Civil War had shown that uniforms were more than fabric. They were banners of identity, dividing one nation into two. And in the years that followed, as America healed and expanded once more, its army would change again, this time to face new frontiers and new wars far from home. The frontier had the tropical uniform, the new weapons of empire. These would mark the next chapter in the story of the American soldier. If the blue and gray defined the Civil War at a distance up close, the battlefield was a tapestry of uniforms. Some practical, some wildly flamboyant, and none more striking than the uniforms of the Zouaves. To modernize, these outfits almost look out of place, more suited to a parade ground or stage play than the muddy trenches of Virginia. Baggy scarlet trousers ballooned at the knees, sashes of bright cloth wrapped around the waist, jackets trimmed with gold braid, and fezes or turbans crowning their heads. Against the smoky haze of cannon fire, Zouaves looked like a splash of color in a world of dust and blood. But behind the flamboyance lay a serious influence. The Zouave tradition came from French light infantry regiments that had made their reputation in North Africa during the early 19th century. Agile, aggressive, and fiercely disciplined French Zouaves inspired fascination across Europe and America. Their style was exotic, their drill acrobatic, their courage legendary. By the mid-19th century, their look had spread far beyond the Sahara to the streets of New York, Boston, and Chicago. In America, no one embodied the Zouave spirit more than Elmer E. Ellsworth. A close friend of Abraham Lincoln Ellsworth was a charismatic young man who turned military drill into spectacle. He founded a drill company known as the Chicago Zouaves, who dazzled audiences with lightning-fast maneuvers, leaps, spins, and synchronized rifle twirls. Crowds gasped, newspapers raved, and suddenly the Zouave craze swept across the United States. When the Civil War erupted, Ellsworth raised a full regiment in New York. The 11th New York Infantry, nicknamed the Fire Zouaves because many of its men came from the rough, tough ranks of New York City firefighters. Clad in flamboyant uniforms that seemed to dare bullets to find them, the Fire Zouaves marched into battle with confidence and swagger. Their very appearance was meant to terrify opponents and inspire allies. But fate had other plans for Ellsworth. On May 24, 1861, in one of the first skirmishes of the war, Ellsworth tore down a Confederate flag flying above the Marshall House Inn in Alexandria, Virginia. As he descended the stairs with the captured banner, the innkeeper confronted him with a shotgun. A blast rang out. Elmer Ellsworth fell dead, his Zouave uniform stained crimson with his own blood. He was just 24 years old. The nation reeled. Newspapers across the Union published his story. His death, dramatic, symbolic, and tragic, turned Ellsworth into the first Union martyr. Abraham Lincoln himself mourned him deeply, keeping a portrait of Ellsworth in the White House. Recruitment surged as young men across the North vowed to take up arms where Ellsworth had fallen. The Zouave style did not die with him. Regiments on both sides of the Civil War adopted Zouave uniforms, from the Union's Louisiana Tigers to the Confederate Wheats Battalion. Some units wore the full flamboyant dress, while others took only elements of it: red fezzes, sashes, or the short open jackets. The appeal was obvious. In a war where most men wore standard blue or gray wool, the Zouaves stood out. Their uniforms made them visible, memorable, even legendary. To wear the Zouave uniform was to embrace an identity of bravery, daring, and elite skill. On the battlefield, Zouave regiments often lived up to the reputation, charging with ferocity, skirmishing with speed, and holding the line with grit. Yet there was also a terrible irony in their flamboyance. Bright colors made them easy targets. In the smoke of a musket volley or the shell bursts of artillery, a Zouave was a bold mark for enemy fire. Many of the young men who dressed so brilliantly would never return home, their uniforms torn and bloodied in the mud of Antietam, Fredericksburg, or Shiloh. Still, the romance of the Zouaves endured. Soldiers who survived often remembered their regimental dress with pride. Even as the war dragged on and practicality forced many Zouave units to abandon the full costume for simpler uniforms, the memory of their dramatic attire lingered. For decades after the war, veterans would gather in reunions wearing elements of their old Zouave uniforms, their sashes and fezzes faded, but still vivid against the backdrop of memory. The Zouaves reveal something profound about the Civil War. For all its horror and bloodshed, the war was also about identity, how men saw themselves, how they wanted to be remembered. The uniform was never just fabric. It was a statement of belonging, a mark of pride, and sometimes a shield against the fear of death. A Zouave's red trousers were as much an act of defiance as they were a uniform: I will be seen. I will not hide. I will face the enemy boldly. And yet, the war was grinding down the romance. By 1863, practicality reasserted itself. The Union and Confederate armies standardized more and more, pressing their soldiers into darker, plainer uniforms, better suited to supply chains and the realities of mass war. Bright sashes gave way to cartridge belts. Fezzes vanished beneath slouch hats and kepis. The battlefield had no patience for fashion. But the legend of the Zouaves lived on, etched into the memory of the Civil War as surely as the blue and gray. Their flamboyant uniforms reminded later generations that war, for all its mechanized destruction, was still fought by men who sought courage in color, pride in appearance, and immortality in distinction. As the guns fell silent in 1865, the war had claimed over 600,000 lives. The blue uniforms of the Union had prevailed, and the gray coats of the Confederacy lay folded in surrender. The Zouaves, too, faded from the battlefield, their bright uniforms consigned to museums' photographs and veterans' gatherings. Yet the war had changed the United States forever. No longer a fragile republic, the Union emerged tested, scarred, but unbroken. And with it, the Army transformed. From now on, it would no longer be a patchwork of flamboyant regiments and improvised supplies. It would move toward a new identity, standardized, professional, and ready for a world that was growing larger and more dangerous by the year. For America was expanding. The frontier called, the Pacific beckoned. And as the 19th century marched onward, the U.S. Army would march with it, trading the bright cloth of the Zouaves for new uniforms that would suit deserts, jungles, and faraway islands. The age of expansion had begun. The Civil War had ended, but the United States did not rest. The nation, bloodied and scarred, now turned its gaze westward. Railroads stretched like steel veins across plains and mountains, stitching together a continent. Settlers pushed into territories once roamed by buffalo and native tribes, and with them marched the soldiers of a new America. This was no longer the farmer's militia or the flamboyant Zouave. The army that strode into the late 19th century was leaner, more standardized, and more professional. Its uniforms reflected this shift. Practicality, once a necessity born of shortage, became a deliberate choice. The most iconic change came in the form of the Montana peak hat. Born of the frontier, this wide-brimmed hat with 4 dents at the crown became the soldier's shield against blistering sun, wind, and rain. Unlike the kepis of the Civil War, which looked smart but offered little protection, the Montana peak was suited for the endless expanse of the West. It was as much a tool as a symbol, shading eyes on the march, keeping the rain from dripping into a rifle's lock, and serving as a piece of unmistakable American identity. In time, it would evolve into the campaign hat still worn by drill sergeants today, a living relic of the frontier soldier. These men, sometimes called Indian fighters in the parlance of the time, wore uniforms adapted to hardship. Their coats were simpler, often khaki or dark blue, their belts heavy with cartridges. Their duties were harsh: to patrol remote outposts, protect settlers, and wage brutal campaigns against native tribes resisting the advance of the United States. The wars of the frontier were unlike the set-piece battles of the Revolution or Civil War. They were wars of ambush and skirmish, of long marches across deserts, and of nights spent in lonely forts surrounded by vast silence. In these campaigns, uniforms became markers of endurance. A coat stained with dust and sweat, a hat battered by wind boots worn thin on rocky ground. These were not mere signs of poverty, but of service. Soldiers might go months without seeing a tailor or a supply wagon. They patched their uniforms with whatever cloth they could find, just as their Civil War predecessors had done, but now it was against the backdrop of mesas and prairies rather than Antietam or Gettysburg. As America's power grew, so too did its ambitions. By the 1890s, the nation had entered the global stage. The Spanish-American War of 1898 marked a turning point. No longer confined to its own continent, the U.S. Army sailed to Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Their new climates demanded new attire. The Army developed tropical lightweight uniforms, khaki-colored to blend with sun and soil. Wool, so common in earlier wars, was unbearable in the heat of Havana or Manila. Cotton and lighter fabrics became essential, allowing soldiers to move with greater comfort in sweltering jungles. For the first time, the American soldier's uniform was not only about practicality or tradition, it was about adapting to global environments. And with these campaigns came new symbols of identity. The Rough Riders, led by Theodore Roosevelt, became legendary for their charge up San Juan Hill in Cuba. Their khaki uniforms, bandoliers slung across their chests, and slouch hats tilted low over their eyes gave them a rugged frontier-born look that resonated with Americans at home. The Rough Riders were volunteers, not career soldiers, but their uniforms, practical, simple, effective, reflected a new kind of American warrior, one who could fight not just in the fields of Virginia, but on the ridges of foreign lands. The war also cemented America's place as a global power. With victory came overseas territories and responsibilities. Soldiers now marched not only in the West, but across the Pacific, garrisoning Guam, Hawaii, and the Philippines. Their uniforms became a visual declaration of expansion, America's presence in faraway lands stitched into khaki seams and brass buttons. But this expansion came with contradictions. The The same army that had once been a symbol of liberty in the Revolution now enforced control over distant peoples. The tropical uniforms worn in the Philippines were not just fabric. They were reminders to the locals of American authority. In this sense, the uniform had become not only a symbol of identity for the soldier, but also a symbol of empire for the world. Still, within the army itself, the uniform remained deeply personal. Soldiers carved initials into the leather of their belts, bent the brims of their hats just so, or tied bandanas beneath their collars to ward off sweat. The American soldier of the late 19th century was part of a machine. Yes, but he was also still the individual adapting, improvising, and shaping his identity within the constraints of regulation cloth. By the dawn of the 20th century, the U.S. Army was no longer a provincial force. It had tested itself against foreign powers, adapted its uniforms to deserts and tropics, and proven that it could march beyond its own borders. But new storms were gathering on the horizon. Across the Atlantic, empires bristled with modern weapons. Trenches, machine guns, and barbed wire were reshaping the very nature of war. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, its soldiers would step onto the world stage wearing uniforms designed not for frontier skirmishes or colonial policing, but for the first truly global conflict. The blue coats and Montana peaks would give way to khaki wool and steel helmets. The age of the doughboy was about to begin. The frontier soldier with his campaign hat and khaki tunic would fade into memory, but his spirit-rugged, practical, adaptable would march on into the mud of France carried by a new generation of Americans. The guns of Europe had thundered since 1914, tearing apart the old world order. The United States had remained distant at first, separated by oceans, but by 1917, the call could no longer be ignored. German submarines prowled the Atlantic, American ships went down, and the infamous Zimmerman telegram promised Mexico the lands of Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico if it joined Germany against the US. The tide of neutrality broke. America entered the war. And with that entry came a new image of the American soldier, the doughboy. The nickname had uncertain origins. Some said it came from the flour-dusted uniforms of infantrymen marching through dusty Mexican deserts decades earlier. Others believed it derived from the buttons on early uniforms, round and dumpling-like. Whatever the source, by 1917, the term had stuck. To the world, the doughboy was the American fighting man of the Great War. Gone were the slouch hats and frontier khakis. In their place came uniforms that echoed America's allies. The soldiers of the American Expeditionary Force, AEF, wore woolen khaki tunics and trousers, sturdy boots, putees, wound tightly around their lower legs, and a new and distinct piece of headgear, the Brodie helmet. The helmet, first developed by the British, was little more than a shallow steel bowl with a narrow brim. But in the trenches, where artillery rained death from above, it offered life-saving protection. Americans nicknamed it the tin hat or dishpan, but it became iconic all the same. It was not elegant, but it was practical, and practical was all that mattered on the battlefields of France. When the doughboys arrived, they were greeted with a mix of admiration and doubt. Europeans had fought for years in the mud of the Western Front, their armies drained and hardened by slaughter. The Americans were fresh, untested, and often clumsy in drill compared to British and French veterans. Their uniforms were new, their rifles clean, their boots barely scuffed. But soon, the world would learn that freshness could also mean ferocity. The trench war was like nothing America had ever known. Rows of sandbags, barbed wire glistening in the rain, endless mazes of dugouts and dug-in machine guns. The doughboys learned quickly that their wool uniforms, so warm in camp, became sodden sponges in the rain. Mud caked onto boots until they felt like stone. The helmet, though protective, turned icy cold in winter, the rim dripping water down collars. Gas masks became as essential as rifles slung across chests in anticipation of the next cloud of mustard gas. Yet for all the discomfort, there was pride in the uniform. Doughboys wore it as a badge of transformation. They were no longer farmers, students, or factory workers. They were Americans in France, carrying not only rifles, but the weight of their nation's reputation. Each khaki coat and steel helmet symbolized America's arrival on the global stage, no longer an isolated republic, but a power to be reckoned with. The battles they fought became legend. At Cantigny, American troops launched their first major offensive, seizing the village and holding it against counterattacks. At Château-Thierry and Belleau-Wood, Marines and soldiers alike fought with ferocity, earning the Marines the nickname "Devil Dogs" from the Germans. The doughboys charged through shell fire and machine gun nests, their uniforms torn and blackened, their helmets dented by shrapnel, their gas masks often pulled on in desperation as yellow clouds rolled across the trenches. At Saint-Mihiel and in the massive Meuse-Argonne offensive, more than 1 million Americans pushed forward in one of the largest operations of the war. Their khaki uniforms were now indistinguishable from the mud around them, their boots soaked and rotting, but their momentum was unstoppable. The AEF under General John J. Pershing proved that American industry manpower and spirit could turn the tide of the war. But the cost was immense. Over 100,000 Americans were killed, and many more returned home wounded in body and spirit. For those who survived, the uniform became a relic of sacrifice. Veterans kept their helmets and gas masks tucked away in trunks. Their khaki tunics hung in closets as reminders of when they had crossed the ocean to fight in the war to end all wars. The uniform itself carried stories. Helmets bore dents from near misses, tunics bore stains of mud and blood, and boots bore the wear of endless marches. Some soldiers carved initials into their Brody helmets, painted insignia on them, or tied keepsakes inside their gas mask bags. Each modification was a human touch in a war that often seemed mechanized and inhuman. The doughboy uniform also marked the final shedding of the old frontier image. The American soldier was no longer defined by wide-brimmed hats and slouch coats. He was part of a modern mechanized army. Steel helmets, gas masks, barbed wire, and machine guns defined his world. The war had changed not only the soldier's appearance, but also his very identity. For the first time, America had sent millions of men to fight overseas, and in doing so, it discovered a new sense of self. The uniform was no longer simply a matter of national pride. It was a declaration America had arrived on the world stage clothed in khaki and steel. When the armistice came in November 1918, doughboys poured into towns and villages across France, cheered by liberated civilians. Their uniforms were ragged, their helmets scarred, but to the French, they looked like saviors. The sight of American soldiers marching in columns, khaki wool, turning golden in the autumn light, became an image of deliverance. Back home, parades filled the streets. Families waved flags as their sons returned, uniforms faded but still intact, medals pinned proudly to their chests. The doughboy, look the puttees, the tunic, the Brody helmet became etched into American memory, immortalized in statues and photographs. Even today, when we imagine the American soldier of World War I, it is this image that comes first: the khaki-clad doughboy, rifle in hand, helmet on head, trudging forward through mud and fire. And yet, as the 1920s dawned, the world learned a bitter lesson. The war to end all wars had not ended war at all. The doughboys would march no more, but their sons would. 2 decades later, America would once again be called across oceans to fight. And when they did, their uniforms would once again evolve from khaki wool and tin hats to olive drab and steel helmets designed for the mechanized inferno of World War II. The doughboy uniform faded into history, but its spirit fresh, determined unmistakably, American remained. It was the uniform of America's first global army, the cloth in which the United States took its first steps as a world power. The blue of the Revolution, the gray of the Civil War, the khaki of the frontier, all of it had led here to the trenches of France. And from here, the American soldier would march into an even darker storm. The doughboys of the First World War had returned home with their khaki wool uniforms and battered tin hats tucked away in memory chests. But by the late 1930s, storm clouds were gathering again. Across the Atlantic and Pacific, new powers rose: fascist Germany, Imperial Japan, and a world that seemed determined to march once more into fire. When the United States finally entered World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, its soldiers carried with them not only the lessons of the Great War, but also the beginnings of a new look, one that would become iconic in the 20th century. Gone were the Brody dishpans of World War I. In their place came the M1 steel helmet, a rounded shell with a distinctive brim that became one of the most recognizable silhouettes in modern history. Unlike the shallow British design, the M1 covered more of the head and neck, giving far greater protection. For decades to come, it would be the American soldier's companion from North Africa to Vietnam. The uniforms too shifted. Soldiers now wore olive drab wool and cotton battle dress, durable and practical, paired with canvas leggings and rugged boots. The American fighting man looked less like a colonial throwback and more like a modern infantryman built for global war. The first major test came in North Africa in 1942. Under the code name Operation Torch, American troops landed in Algeria and Morocco, joining British forces and striking at the German Afrika Korps under the famed General Erwin Rommel. It was here in the blazing deserts that the American soldier first faced the Wehrmacht, a battle-hardened force that had already swept across Europe. The olive drab uniforms designed for temperate climates were stifling under the African sun. Soldiers improvised, rolling up sleeves, cutting trousers into shorts, tying bandanas beneath their helmets. Dust and sand stained every inch of cloth, working into boots until the skin blistered. And yet, the Americans adapted. They fought alongside British troops clad in khaki shorts and pith helmets, learning desert warfare against an enemy that seemed unbreakable. Slowly, painfully, the tide turned. From the sands of Kasserine Pass, where Green American divisions took heavy losses, to the final victory in Tunisia, the U.S. Army proved it could stand against the best Germany had to offer. From there, the war carried them across the Mediterranean to Italy, where uniforms once again met the reality of terrain. The olive drab that had baked in North Africa now clung heavy with rain and mud in the mountains of Sicily, Salerno, and Anzio. Soldiers wrapped themselves in raincoats, waterproof capes, and whatever they could scavenge. Helmets bore netting and foliage for camouflage. The uniform was no longer just a mark of identity, it was a tool of survival. But the American Army was not only learning how to fight conventionally, it was also experimenting with a new kind of warrior inspired by Germany's daring Fallschirmjäger, the paratrooper. The concept was radical. Drop soldiers from the sky behind enemy lines to sow chaos and seize key objectives. It required a special breed of man, one willing to leap into darkness from the open door of a plane, knowing that he would land far from support surrounded by enemies. Their uniforms reflected their role. Paratroopers wore modified jump jackets with extra pockets for ammunition, knives, and grenades. Their boots were stronger, laced higher to withstand the shock of landing. They painted their helmets with distinctive symbols, giving them identity even in the chaos of scattered drops. The first large-scale use of American paratroopers came in Sicily in 1943, where their landings were chaotic but courageous. Later, they would make history in Normandy on the night of June 5-6, 1944, when waves of C-47 aircraft carried the men of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions over occupied France. Dressed in jump gear, faces smeared with black camouflage paint, they leapt into the night sky. Parachutes blossomed against the moonlight as tracer fire streaked upward. Scattered across hedgerows and fields, their uniforms blended into the shadows as they fought in small bands, capturing bridges, cutting roads, and holding villages against furious counterattacks. These airborne troops became legends. Their uniforms, dusty jump jackets, M1 helmets, strapped-tight boots caked with mud became symbols of elite daring. The world would never forget the Screaming Eagles of the 101st, or the All-American 82nd who carried America's hopes on their backs as they dropped into Europe's heart. But the paratroopers were not alone in forging a new reputation. Another elite formation took shape, the Rangers. Drawing inspiration from Britain's commandos, the U.S. Rangers were trained as light infantry specialists in raids and infiltration. They were the shock troops of the American Army, sent where the fighting was hardest. Their moment of fame came on D-Day, June 6, 1944, when the 2nd and 5th Ranger Battalion scaled the sheer cliffs of Pointe du Hoc under withering German fire. With ropes, ladders, and raw courage, they clawed their way up, their uniforms shredded by rock and shrapnel. At the top, they discovered the German artillery pieces they had been sent to destroy had already been moved. Yet they pressed on, searching, finding, and silencing the guns before they could devastate the beaches below. Their losses were staggering, but their mission succeeded. Elsewhere, the Rangers carved their reputation in Italy at Anzio, where they fought with relentless determination against entrenched German forces. They wore the same olive drab as other soldiers, but their discipline, toughness, and esprit de corps set them apart. A Ranger uniform, even without special markings, carried an aura. If you saw a man wearing it, you knew he was trained to go where others would not. From the deserts of North Africa to the cliffs of Normandy, from the mountains of Italy to the forests of France, the American soldier of World War II was forged in every climate and terrain imaginable. His uniform bore the marks of each campaign sand, from the Sahara mud, from Monte Cassino blood, from the hedgerows of Normandy. The olive drab tunic and the M1 helmet became synonymous with the liberator, the citizen soldier who carried America's promise across the globe. And yet, the war was far from over. The men who had stormed beaches and dropped from the skies would soon face the greatest trial of all. In the winter of 1944, amid the frozen forests of Belgium, the German army launched a desperate counterattack. The Battle of the Bulge would test the limits of endurance, courage, and loyalty, and the uniforms of the American soldier would once again become tattered, torn, and soaked in both snow and sacrifice. By the closing months of 1944, many Americans believed victory in Europe was near. Paris had been liberated. Allied armies were pushing into Belgium, and the Netherlands and Germany seemed to be crumbling. Soldiers in olive drab joked that they might be home by Christmas, but Adolf Hitler had one last card to play: a desperate counter-offensive designed to split the Allies and force them to the negotiating table. On December 16, 1944, under the cover of dense fog and snow, German tanks and infantry surged through the Ardennes forest. The attack smashed into thinly held American lines, creating chaos. Roads filled with retreating troops' villages fell one after another, and the bulge in the Allied front gave the battle its name, the Battle of the Bulge. At the heart of this chaos lay the small Belgian town of Bastogne. Roads converged there, making it a vital hub. Whoever held Bastogne controlled the arteries of the region. Into the storm marched the men of the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles. Fresh from fighting across Normandy and Holland, they were rushed to Bastogne with little preparation. Trucks carried them through snow and ice, their uniforms inadequate for the brutal winter that awaited. The 101st were airborne infantry trained for parachute drops, not for defensive sieges in freezing forests. Their gear reflected their rolled jump boots, airborne jackets, helmets marked with spade or club insignia. But what they lacked was winter clothing. Wool gloves, heavy coats, overshoes, these were scarce. Many men wrapped themselves in captured German scarves or civilian blankets. Their uniforms froze stiff with snow and ice. The olive drab that had marched across France now turned pale under layers of frost. By December 20th, Bastogne was encircled. 7 German divisions, including armored units, surrounded the town. Artillery pounded the defenses, shells crashing into stone houses and splintering pine forests. Snow fell thick, muffling the sound of boots and gunfire. The men of the 101st dug foxholes, lined them with whatever branches or cloth they could scavenge, and huddled in pairs to share warmth. Their uniforms were tattered, their boots soaked, their rations dwindling, and yet they refused to break. The siege of Bastogne became a crucible of endurance. Ammunition ran low. Medical supplies were almost non-existent. Wounded men lay in barns and basements wrapped in bloodied uniforms, stiff with cold. And still, the Screaming Eagles held the line. On December 22nd, a German delegation approached the American positions under a white flag. They carried a written demand: surrender Bastogne or face total annihilation. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st, read the message and laughed. His written reply was a single word: nuts. That defiance became legendary. The Germans, bewildered by the slang, could not comprehend its meaning until an American officer explained it meant go to hell. The uniforms of the 101st may have been ragged and frozen, but the spirit within them was unbreakable. For days, the siege dragged on. German tanks prowled the forests, their engines growling in the snow. Paratroopers, their olive drab coated in white sheets for camouflage, fired bazookas from ditches and foxholes. Machine gunners huddled in icy nests, their hands numb on the triggers. Men rotated their socks by drying them against their bodies, desperate to stave off frostbite. In those days, survival was as much about will as about weapon. Finally, on December 26th, the siege broke. Elements of General George S. Patton's Third Army, advancing with desperate speed, broke through German lines and reached Bastogne. Relief columns rolled into the town, bringing food, ammunition, and medical supplies. The Screaming Eagles, battered but unbowed, emerged from their foxholes with frostbitten faces, gaunt from hunger yet still in uniform, still standing. The Battle of Bastogne had lasted barely a week, but it had carved itself into history. Outnumbered and outgunned, the 101st Airborne had held against overwhelming force, buying precious time for the Allies to regroup. Their uniforms, airborne jackets patched with holes, boots cracked from ice helmets dented by shrapnel, became relics of defiance. To this day, they are preserved in museums, silent witnesses to the endurance of the American soldier. The broader Battle of the Bulge raged on until late January 1945, claiming tens of thousands of lives. Snow-covered forests became graveyards of men and machines. German troops wore white camouflage smocks blending with the snow, while Americans improvised with bed sheets and painted gear. Both armies struggled not only against each other, but against nature itself, a winter so cold that rifles jammed, blood froze on the ground, and breath turned to ice in the air. But in the end, the American uniform, ragged as it was, stood firm. The olive drab of the U.S. Army did not retreat. The Screaming Eagles of Bastogne became legend, their motto echoing long after the snow-melted rendezvous with destiny. The uniforms of the Bulge tell a story beyond fabric. They were not just clothing, they were symbols of resilience. Torn coats and frozen boots were worn by men who refused surrender, who stood when logic said they should fall. In every ripped sleeve and frostbitten toe was a testament to courage. After Bastogne, the 101st Airborne continued its march into Germany, their uniforms carrying the scars of that winter. The final push across the Rhine, the liberation of concentration camps, the fall of Berlin, all of it lay ahead. But for many, it was Bastogne that defined them. When the war ended in May 1945, American soldiers stood victorious across Europe. From the deserts of North Africa to the snowy forests of Belgium, they had marched in olive drab and steel, bearing the weight of liberation. Their uniforms, once standard issue, had become symbols of freedom for millions. And yet, even as Europe celebrated another theater of war, still raged a brutal, unforgiving struggle across the islands of the Pacific. Their American uniforms would meet a new test, not of snow and frost, but of jungle heat, volcanic ash, and relentless battle against an enemy who would fight to the death. The next chapter of the American uniform would be written not in olive drab against snow, but in sweat-soaked fatigues against jungle green. And at its heart would stand the Marines, whose image on the black sands of Iwo Jima would become one of the most enduring symbols of the 20th century. While the 101st Airborne dug into the icy forests of Europe halfway around the globe, another branch of America's fighting force carved its legend into the volcanic rock and steaming jungles of the Pacific. Here, the U.S. Marines, under the broad shield of the U.S. Navy, waged a campaign unlike any the nation had ever fought before. It was a war of islands, dots of coral and jungle, scattered across a vast ocean, each one fortified by the Japanese Empire. To defeat Japan, America would have to take these islands one by one, in what came to be known as the Island Hopping Campaign. Each step brought the Marines closer to the Japanese homeland, and each step was paid for in blood. The Marines' uniforms reflected the environment they fought in. Instead of the heavy wool and olive drab of Europe, they wore herringbone twill fatigues, lightweight and breathable, dyed in shades of green and brown to blend with jungle and beach. Helmets were covered with camouflage netting, often stuffed with bits of foliage. On their backs, they carried canteens, ammunition pouches, and trenching tools, and sometimes flamethrowers, brutal instruments in a war where enemies dug into caves and bunkers. Their boots were stained with salt water and mud, their sleeves rolled against the heat. sweat grime and exhaustion soaked into every seam. The Pacific War was as much a battle against nature as against the enemy. The Marines landed on beaches under withering fire, storming sands that seemed to swallow their boots. They hacked through vines and bamboo, swarmed across ridges of volcanic rock, and fought through rains that turned foxholes into rivers. Their uniforms, designed for tropical wear, were never dry. Salt stiffened cloth, mildew rotted it, and blood left dark stains that never washed away. At Guadalcanal in 1942, the Marines fought their first great test. Their uniforms, ragged within weeks, bore the strain of hunger and disease as much as bullets. Malaria and dysentery weakened them, but their green fatigues remained visible in the jungle, a constant reminder to friend and foe alike that America was here to stay. From island to island, Tarawa, Saipan, Palayu, the story repeated. Marines stormed beaches, their uniforms darkened by sea water as they splashed ashore under artillery fire. They clutched M1 Garand rifles, their helmets rattling with each explosion. Sand fused to sweat, creating rashes beneath their belts. In photographs from these battles, the Marines' faces are set in grim determination, their uniforms clinging to their bodies as if the fabric itself had absorbed the will to endure. And then came Iwo Jima, February 1945. A black volcanic island, 8 square miles of hell. The Marines who landed wore the same herringbone fatigues, but within hours, their uniforms were coated in fine dark ash that seeped into every fold. They crawled forward under machine gun fire, their boots slipping in sand that burned hot from the sun by day and chilled bone deep at night. The air stank of sulfur. The island's Japanese defenders dug deep into caves, turned every ridge into a fortress. For 36 days, the battle raged. Marines advanced yard by yard, their uniforms shredded by shrapnel and torn on jagged rock. Helmets bore dents where near misses had struck. Some men tied strips of cloth around their helmets to identify themselves in the chaos. Others carved notches into their rifles or scribbled initials on their gear. In this place, even identity clung desperately to fabric and steel. And then, amid the carnage, came the moment that would immortalize the Marines' uniform forever. On February 23, 1945, a group of 6 Marines raised the American flag atop Mount Suribachi. Their herringbone fatigues whipped in the Pacific wind, their helmets bowed against the strain of the pole. The image, captured by photographer Joe Rosenthal, became one of the most iconic photographs in history. The Marines' uniforms, dusty and battered, became symbols of American resolve. That flag raising was not the end. The battle for Iwo Jima raged for weeks more, but it was the image that endured. It told the world that America would endure any sacrifice, climb any mountain to claim victory. The Marines who raised the flag wore the same fabric as thousands of others who never returned from those sands, making the uniform itself a memorial. The Pacific Campaign did not end at Iwo Jima. The Marines moved on to Okinawa, the last and bloodiest island battle of the war. Here, rain turned battlefields into mud pits, soaking uniforms until they fell apart at the seams. Soldiers fought hand-to-hand in caves, their fatigues torn to rags. By the time Okinawa was secured, over 12,000 Americans had been killed, and their uniforms, scattered across hills and ravines, bore silent witness to the cost of victory. What made the Marines' uniforms distinct in memory was not their cut or color, but their endurance. Unlike the olive drab wool of Europe, the green fatigues of the Pacific seemed less formal, more brutal, more lived in. They were the clothing of men who crawled through mud, who stormed beaches, who carried flamethrowers into caves. They were utilitarian, stripped of ceremony, soaked in sweat and seawater, and yet they became sacred. For the Marines themselves, the uniform was both armor and curse. It protected against sunburn, concealed them in jungle shadows, but it also held the heat-rubbed raw skin and never truly dried. Still, they wore it with pride. To be a Marine in those fatigues was to belong to a brotherhood forged in suffering and sacrifice. When the war ended and Japan surrendered after the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, many Marines returned home with their uniforms packed away, never to be worn again. Some were buried in them. Others kept them folded in trunks pulled out only decades later to show grandchildren. The fabric frayed with age, but the meaning never faded. The image of the Marines at Iwo Jima cemented something deeper. The uniform as symbol not only of war, but of myth. Just as the blue coats of the Revolution had once marked a new nation, the herringbone fatigues of the Marines marked America as a global superpower. The Pacific Crucible had ended, but in the skies above Europe and Asia, another branch of the US military had also carved its mark. While Marines raised flags on volcanic peaks, the Army Air Forces soared overhead, their uniforms bearing wings that promised to dominate the skies. The story of America's uniform was about to leave the jungle floor and climb into the clouds. While Marines clawed their way across beaches and through jungles, another branch of the US military was carrying the war into the skies. By the 1940s, the age of air power had dawned, and the American soldier was no longer only defined by mud and marching boots. Above the clouds, men in flight jackets, leather helmets, and goggles waged a war as merciless as any fought on land. The United States Army Air Forces, USAAF, then still part of the Army, wore uniforms that reflected their new domain. The standard olive drab remained for many ground crews, but for pilots and aircrew, leather jackets, shearling-lined coats, and heavy flying boots became iconic. Airmen bore the Hap Arnold Wings insignia, a star with a pair of wings, a mark of pride that declared them part of this new force of war. The skies over Europe became their crucible. From airfields in England, waves of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators roared into the sky bound for Germany. Their uniforms were not simply for appearance, they were survival. At 20,000 feet, the air was freezing. Crews bundled into sheepskin jackets, wool-lined gloves, and oxygen masks that frosted over as they breathed. Goggles, iced boots stiffened, and every layer of fabric became a thin barrier between life and the killing cold. These men fought not only the enemy, but also the elements. Their uniforms stiffened with sweat and frost, soaked in the stench of fuel and oil, marked with the burns of flak fragments. Inside those planes, airmen hunched at machine gun positions, scanning the skies for German fighters. When bursts of flak tore holes through fuselages, uniforms were shredded along with flesh. A leather bomber jacket might return with patches upon patches, each scar on the cloth a reminder of close brushes with death. The bombing campaign against Germany was relentless. Factories, rail yards, oil refineries, all were targeted, and with each raid, more young men disappeared into smoke. The American uniform in this theater was not about marching across fields, but about sitting in cramped bomb bays, about parachutes packed tight, about patches sewn to jackets with names of girlfriends, Lucky Charms, or hand-painted images of pin-up girls and mascots. The personalization of these uniforms spoke volumes. Every man sought a touch of humanity amid the mechanical slaughter of the skies. Yet, air power was not confined to Europe. In the Pacific, the USAAF carried the fight island by island, softening Japanese positions with bombing raids, before Marines and soldiers stormed the beaches. Here, tropical uniforms mingled with flight gear, and airfields carved out of coral became staging grounds for raids on Japan itself. The most dramatic chapter came in 1945, when America unveiled a weapon unlike any the world had ever seen. From the Enola Gay, a silver B-29 Super Fortress crewman in flight uniforms carried out a mission that would end the war but haunt the conscience of humanity. On August 6th, they dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, another B-29 Boxcar delivered the second bomb to Nagasaki. The uniforms worn by those crews were not visibly different from thousands of others. Olive drab coveralls, flight jackets, goggles against the glare. Yet the missions they carried out transformed those garments into artifacts of history. Their fabric bore no marks of ash or radiation, but the consequences of what they did burned into the very soul of civilization. For the men who flew those missions, their uniforms became inseparable from moral weight. Some believed they had saved millions by ending the war swiftly. Others carried guilt for unleashing such devastation. But whatever they felt, the world could never see their uniforms the same way again. They were no longer just fabric stitched for war. They were the attire worn at the dawn of the nuclear age. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the war was over, but the transformation of the American military was only beginning. The Army Air Forces, once just a branch, became so central to modern war that in 1947, it was split off entirely as its own service, the United States Air Force. With it came new uniforms, new insignia, and a new identity, one no longer tied to the mud of trenches but to the sky itself. The Second World War had shown the world the full spectrum of the American soldier's uniform: olive drab fatigues in the mud of Europe, green twill in the jungles of the Pacific, bomber jackets in the icy skies, and the flight suits that carried the bombs that ended the war. Together, they painted a portrait of a military that could fight anywhere, in any environment by land, sea, or air. But victory brought new challenges. America now stood as a global superpower with troops stationed across continents. And the uniform, once a symbol of defiance against tyranny, was now also a symbol of responsibility. Soldiers who once marched home triumphant now found themselves stationed in Germany, Japan, Korea, guardians of a fragile peace. Yet even in this new era, the basic truths endured. A uniform was never just clothing. It was memory, identity, and meaning stitched into fabric. Every seam told a story. Every tear marked a sacrifice. And as America entered the Cold War, the soldier's uniform would once again adapt to new battlefields. The next conflict would not be fought in the skies over Europe or the volcanic sands of Iwo Jima, but in the cold hills of Korea and the steaming jungles of Vietnam. The olive drab would remain, but the world was changing. America's uniforms, like America itself, would change with it. The end of the Second World War brought parades, medals, and reunions, but peace did not last. Within 5 years, American soldiers once again marched into battle. This time not in Europe or the Pacific, but on the icy hills of a divided peninsula called Korea. In 1950, North Korean forces surged across the 38th parallel, driving the South's defenders and their American allies into retreat. The United States mobilized, and once more, olive drab uniforms filled transport ships. In many ways, the American infantryman of Korea looked much like his counterpart from World War II. The M1 helmet, the wool trousers, the canvas web gear all remained. But there were subtle changes, reflecting lessons learned in global conflict. The M1951 field jacket, insulated and layered for the brutal cold, became standard. Soldiers wore pile caps with ear flaps beneath their steel helmets and mittens large enough to be worn over trigger gloves. Despite these efforts, the Korean winter was merciless. At the Chosin Reservoir in late 1950, temperatures plunged to 30 degrees. American soldiers fought in frozen uniforms, their jackets stiff as boards, their boots cracking from ice. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Yet in that frozen hell, the olive drab silhouette still advanced, retreating in order but never collapsing. But Korea was not only about cold. It was also about change within the army itself. In 1948, President Harry S. Truman had signed Executive Order 9981, desegregating the armed forces. Korea was the first major conflict where black and white soldiers fought side by side in integrated units. The uniform, once a dividing line in American society, now became a common garment of equality in combat. Under olive drab, men bled together, proving that unity in battle could outpace prejudice at home. The Korean War ended in stalemate, the 38th parallel restored, but the lessons endured. America had fought not only in Europe and the Pacific, but now in Asia, and the uniform carried the stains of yet another continent. Soldiers returned home, weary, often overlooked their uniforms, folded away without parades. Yet the army itself was reshaped, standing as a permanent global force. 2 decades later, that force marched again, this time into the steaming jungles of Southeast Asia. Vietnam would become the most controversial and haunting war in American history, and its uniforms would tell a story of both endurance and disillusionment. By the early 1960s, soldiers deployed to Vietnam wore the new OG-107 jungle fatigues. Lightweight cotton uniforms dyed in dark green shades. Designed for breathability, they replaced heavy wool with cloth that could dry faster in humidity. Sleeves were often rolled-up collars, loosened boots specially made with drainage vents to fight the constant swamp-like conditions. The helmets remained the familiar M1, now often fitted with camouflage covers or netting. Yet the jungle was relentless. Heat and moisture turned even the best fabrics into sodden rags. Soldiers' shirts clung to their bodies darkened with sweat, while trousers tore on bamboo and elephant grass. In time, uniforms literally rotted off the body seams, disintegrating from mildew. Veterans recalled wearing shirts until they dissolved, boots until the soles peeled away, belts until the leather cracked from moisture. A torn, faded uniform became its own mark of survival, a visual shorthand for the word veteran. Combat in Vietnam was unlike the trench lines of Europe or the island assaults of the Pacific. Guerrilla warfare meant that soldiers fought ambushes in rice paddies, patrols through dripping jungles, sudden firefights along dirt trails. Uniforms were constantly soaked, stained with mud, or shredded by shrapnel. Blood left brown-black marks that never washed out. Soldiers improvised endlessly, tying bandanas, cutting sleeves, adding extra pockets, wearing locally made sandals in place of boots. And beyond the physical, the uniform bore symbolic weight. For the men in the field, it was armor against the elements, a symbol of belonging in hostile territory. But back home, those same green fatigues became symbols of division. Unlike World War II, where uniforms drew cheers in the streets, Vietnam veterans returned to protests and scorn. Many stripped off their uniforms as soon as they landed, unwilling to face hostility in what should have been a mark of service. The psychological bond between soldier and uniform frayed. What once meant honor and unity now sometimes meant shame or alienation. Yet within the ranks, the uniform still carried deep meaning. It was the last thing many saw of their comrades, a sleeve torn by shrapnel, a helmet lying in the mud, a boot abandoned in the jungle. The uniform of Vietnam became as much a symbol of loss as of duty. And still the ingenuity of soldiers shone through. Units began painting slogans or peace symbols on helmets, writing girlfriends' names, or scrawling mottos like "Born to Kill." These markings were unofficial, even rebellious, but they reflected the complex emotions of a generation caught between loyalty and doubt. The green fatigues became a canvas for personal expression, a quiet act of identity amid the chaos. By the time America withdrew in 1973, more than 500,000 soldiers had served in Vietnam. Their uniforms, sweat-stained and torn, carried the memory of jungles, firefights, and nights spent listening for movement in the dark. For many veterans, the sight or smell of those uniforms decades later could bring back the war in an instant. The crack of AK-47 fire, the stench of napalm, the endless drone of insects in the heat. Vietnam changed not only the perception of the uniform, but also the army itself. No longer could America view war as a simple matter of victory parades and noble sacrifice. The uniform now bore the complexity of disillusionment, resilience, and trauma. Veterans came home with their fatigues tucked away in closets, reminders of a war the nation itself struggled to acknowledge. And yet, those uniforms endure in memory. Museums display them faded and torn, their name tapes barely legible. To look upon one is to feel the weight of history, the sweat of jungles, the ache of loss, the endurance of men who fought in a war few wanted to remember. The olive drab of Korea, the jungle green of Vietnam, both told the same story in different ways of American soldiers thrust into foreign lands wearing uniforms that adapted to terrain but could never shield them from the deeper wounds of conflict. When the last helicopters lifted from Saigon in 1975, leaving behind desperate crowds on rooftops, the image was seared into history. Soldiers in green fatigues, helmets, tilted rifles slung, looking down at a war that had consumed so much and resolved so little. And yet, the uniform endured. For in the decades to come, the American soldier would march again, this time not into jungles, but into deserts of the Middle East where sand, not rain, would stain the cloth of war. When the last helicopters lifted from Saigon in 1975, many thought America's appetite for war had been spent. Vietnam had left scars that cut deep into the nation's psyche. The image of soldiers in jungle fatigues, weary and disillusioned, haunted the public. But history has a way of dragging nations back into conflict, and by the 1990s, the American soldier once again stepped into the spotlight, this time in the vast deserts of the Middle East. In August 1990, the Iraqi army under Saddam Hussein swept into Kuwait, seizing the oil-rich nation in a matter of hours. The world reacted with shock. Within weeks, a coalition of nations, the largest assembled since World War II, prepared to drive Iraq back. America was at the heart of it. The world would come to know this conflict as Operation Desert Shield and soon after, Operation Desert Storm. The uniforms were unlike those of any previous war. Gone were the greens of Vietnam and the olive drab of World War II. In their place appeared the chocolate chip desert camouflage tan fabric, patterned with blotches of brown and black, designed to mimic the rocky, sandy terrain of the Arabian desert. For the first time in history, the American soldier's look was broadcast live into living rooms around the world. Cable news showed endless footage of convoys snaking across sand dunes, soldiers crouched in bunkers, and generals briefing in desert camouflage fatigues. This war was not only fought on the battlefield, it was fought on television, and the uniform was part of the image. Desert camouflage paired with Kevlar helmets, flak vests, and night vision goggles made the American soldier look modern, professional, and unstoppable. The chocolate chip pattern became iconic, not for its effectiveness. Some soldiers joked it looked more like breakfast cereal than desert rock, but because it became the face of a lightning-fast victory. When Desert Storm began in January 1991, the coalition unleashed one of the most devastating air campaigns in history, followed by a ground offensive that lasted barely 100 hours. American soldiers in desert camouflage stormed across the sands, their uniforms stained by dust storms, their boots filled with grit. The world watched as they advanced with overwhelming firepower, pushing Iraqi forces into retreat and liberating Kuwait. But victory did not erase the human realities. Soldiers recalled the burning oil fields where fires set by retreating Iraqis turned the skies black. The desert camouflage uniforms, designed to blend with sand, now stood silhouetted against a backdrop of flame and smoke. Helmets and flak vests reeked of petroleum, the stench clinging for weeks. Those uniforms, captured in photographs beneath skies choked with fire, became lasting symbols of the Gulf War triumph over aggression, but also the reminder that war always leaves scars on the land and those who fight upon it. Yet the 1990s were not finished with the American soldier. A new conflict soon emerged, this time in the heart of Europe. In 1999, the world's attention turned to the Balkans. The breakup of Yugoslavia had already plunged the region into years of ethnic violence. But when Serbian forces launched a campaign of ethnic cleansing in Kosovo, NATO intervened. For 78 days, the skies thundered with bombing raids. American soldiers deployed not just to drop bombs, but also to provide ground support and humanitarian aid. The uniforms of this era had again evolved. The desert chocolate chip had given way to the woodland camouflage pattern designed for Europe's forests and mountains. Soldiers in Kevlar body armor patrolled villages, escorted refugees, and manned checkpoints. Their uniforms no longer carried only the tools of battle, they carried the weight of peacekeeping. For the first time, American soldiers found themselves cast as both warriors and guardians. Their woodland fatigues, often marked with NATO patches, symbolized not conquest, but responsibility. Yet danger was never far. Mines littered fields, sniper fire haunted patrols, and villages bore the scars of massacre. In such places, the uniform was not only a shield against bullets, it was also a shield against despair, a reminder that order and hope could still exist amid ruin. The Balkan Wars also introduced a new piece of gear that would soon become universal: improved Kevlar body armor. Derived from the flak vests of Vietnam, this new armor offered far greater protection against small arms fire and shrapnel. Soldiers in Kosovo wore it over their camouflage uniforms, its bulky plates giving them a distinct squared silhouette. To the civilians they protected, this look became synonymous with safety. The sight of American soldiers meant food convoys, medical aid, and the promise of protection. But while Kosovo burned, another shadow loomed larger. In 2001, the United States would face a tragedy that would once again transform its soldiers' uniforms, its battlefields, and its very conception of war. Before that moment, however, the lesson of the 1990s was clear: the American uniform had become global. No longer tied to a single landscape, it shifted with the terrain desert camouflage for Kuwait woodland, for Kosovo Kevlar, for urban patrols. Each pattern carried with it a story, a conflict, a role America had taken on. The soldier was no longer only a liberator or conqueror. He was now also a peacekeeper, a symbol of stability in fractured lands. But this image was fragile. For all the triumph of Desert Storm and the relief missions in the Balkans, many Americans wondered if the nation's military identity was drifting, caught between victory parades and endless commitments overseas. That uncertainty would vanish in fire and smoke on the morning of September 11, 2001. In its place would come the longest war in American history, and with it new uniforms, new camouflage, and a new enemy unlike any faced before. The deserts of Iraq and the mountains of Afghanistan awaited, and the American soldier would once again change his face to meet them. The morning of September 11, 2001 began like any other. Soldiers were training at bases, officers were running through drills, recruits were sweating through boot camp. And then, in the span of hours, everything changed. The collapse of the Twin Towers, the fire at the Pentagon, the smoldering wreckage in Pennsylvania. The world watched in horror as America was struck in a way it had never been before. The uniforms worn that day became artifacts in themselves. Fatigues covered in dust as National Guard troops dug through rubble helmets, dented as firefighters searched through steel boots scarred by heat and debris. They were no longer just battle dress. They were the garments of a nation in shock. But shock hardened into resolve. Within weeks, America launched the global war on terror, first striking at Al-Qaeda and the Taliban in Afghanistan. Soon after, the war expanded to Iraq. Once again, the American soldier was called to fight, this time not against empires or armies, but against insurgent shadow networks and an enemy who could vanish into mountains or blend into city streets. The battlefields were new, and so were the uniforms. The woodland camouflage of the Cold War was ill-suited for the deserts of Kandahar or the streets of Baghdad. Soldiers were issued new gear, the Desert Camouflage Uniform DCU, with a three-tone tan and brown pattern. It was designed to blend with sand and rock, though soldiers quickly discovered its limits in mixed terrain. In the dust of Afghanistan's mountains, the DCUs were caked with dirt within hours. Helmets were wrapped in cloth or fitted with desert covers. Soldiers tied scarves, shamoks, borrowed from local tradition, around their necks and faces to ward off sandstorms. The desert sun bleached the fabric, turning sharp camouflage into faded shades of beige. Each deployment wore the uniform's thin seams fraying after months of patrols through valleys and villages. When the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003, DCUs once again filled the television screens of the world. This was the first war fought in the true digital age, images, broadcasts, and photographs traveling instantly across the globe. Soldiers in desert fatigues kicked down doors in Baghdad, manned checkpoints in Fallujah, and patrolled streets where danger came not from armies in formation but from roadside bombs hidden beneath the dirt. Urban combat demanded new gear. Body armor became heavier and more advanced. Soldiers wore interceptor vests thick with Kevlar plates that stopped bullets but weighed heavily on weary backs. Helmets now carried mounts for night vision goggles, turning the American soldier into a shadow hunter in the darkened alleys of Iraq. The silhouette of the uniform changed, bulkier, square-shaped by armor and technology. But war reveals flaws as much as strengths. In the mid-2000s, the Army sought a universal solution, a camouflage that could work everywhere. The result was the Army Combat Uniform ACU, patterned in a gray-green universal camouflage pattern UCP. On paper, it was meant to serve in deserts, forests, and cities alike. In practice, it failed almost everywhere. Soldiers joked bitterly that the UCP was perfect camouflage if you're hiding on grandma's couch. Still, for nearly a decade, the UCP became the face of the American soldier. Photographs from Iraq and Afghanistan show endless ranks of gray-green fatigues, helmets squared with night vision gear rifles slung across armored chests. The uniform may have been flawed in concealment, but it became iconic in association. To millions watching abroad, the pixelated gray-green was the color of America's longest war. The environments of the global war on terror left their mark on the cloth. In Afghanistan, mountain winds tore fabric against jagged stone, while in Iraq, sweat and heat wore uniforms thin. Dust storms turned patches of Velcro useless sand, grinding into every seam. Soldiers added personal touches. American flags stitched onto shoulders unit patches or names inked into collars. Helmets bore handwritten mottos or tally marks. Boots became caked with dust that never truly washed away. For many soldiers, the uniform carried contradictions. On one hand, it was armor, a symbol of professionalism, of belonging to something larger. On the other, it was a target. Insurgents aimed for the man in camouflage, knowing he was the symbol of foreign power. Wearing the ACU in Baghdad was both protection and exposure, blending into nothing, yet standing out everywhere. The wars stretched on. Deployments piled up. Soldiers wore through multiple sets of uniforms, each one frayed and patched, carried home in duffel bags that smelled of gun oil, sweat, and sand. For veterans, those uniforms became talismans of memory, folded away in closets, reminders of friends lost and battles survived. And as the years dragged on, lessons once again demanded change. By the 2010s, the Army abandoned the failed UCP and introduced the Operational Camouflage Pattern OCP based on the successful multicam design. Its greens, tans, and browns blended far better with varied terrain from Afghan mountains to Iraqi deserts. Soldiers praised it as practical at last. The OCP, paired with advanced body armor, became the new face of the American soldier, modern, adaptable, and tested by 2 decades of counterinsurgency war. Yet beyond the cloth and the patterns, the meaning of the uniform had shifted again. Unlike World War II or even Desert Storm, there were no clear parades, no singular moment of victory. Instead, the global war on terror became endless deployments without end victories, measured in small gains, losses counted not only in lives, but in years. The uniform became the visible weight of an invisible burden worn by men and women who served in wars that many civilians at home scarcely understood. For the soldiers themselves, though, it remained deeply personal. Each tear, each stain told a story. A sleeve scorched by a Humvee fire, a vest torn by shrapnel, a helmet nicked by a bullet that might have killed. For the men and women who wore them, these uniforms were not abstract symbols of strategy or policy. They were life itself. As the 2010s ended, America's wars in Iraq and Afghanistan wound down. Troops began to withdraw, bases closed, flags were lowered. But the uniform's desert camo, UCP-OCP, remained in memory, preserved in photographs, museums, and veterans' closets. They told the story of a generation that had come of age in endless war, whose service was defined by the gray-green of pixelated camouflage and the dust-stained beige of desert fatigues. The global war on terror reshaped the American uniform once again. It was no longer the blue of the Revolution, the gray of the Civil War, the olive of World War II, or the jungle green of Vietnam. It was digital camouflage, desert tan, and finally the blended OCP of a modern army. And yet, even as those wars faded, the American soldier continued to stand guard. For the uniform is not only a garment of combat, it is also a garment of tradition, ceremony, and memory. In cemeteries, at monuments, and the quiet vigil of Arlington, soldiers in dress uniforms reminded the nation that sacrifice does not end when the guns fall silent. The next chapter would not be about desert fatigue or jungle camouflage, but about memory itself, the way America honors its fallen, and how uniforms became part of that eternal duty. By the late 2010s, the image of the American soldier had become as complex as the wars he fought. For nearly 2 decades, men and women in gray-green digital camouflage had marched across deserts and mountains, their uniforms a visible reminder of conflicts that never seemed to end. The pixelated universal camouflage pattern UCP, once heralded as the future, had been quietly retired. Its shortcomings too obvious to ignore. Soldiers joked that it blended perfectly with concrete parking lots, but nowhere else. The Army had learned a painful lesson: no uniform could be universal. In its place came something better, something tested in the harshest realities of war. The operational camouflage pattern, OCP based on multicam, became standard issue by 2015. Its mix of greens, tans, and browns adapted to multiple environments, whether Afghan valleys, Iraqi streets, or American training grounds. At last, soldiers once again felt their uniforms worked with them rather than against them. The silhouette of the modern soldier was shaped not only by cloth, but also by technology. OCP uniforms were worn beneath layers of advanced body armor plate carriers, helmets with rail mounts for cameras, and night vision goggles. Where once the M1 helmet was a simple dome of steel, now the Advanced Combat Helmet, or Enhanced Combat Helmet, sat heavy with electronics, communications gear, and sensors. The uniform had become part of a larger system, soldier weapon, and technology fused into one. Yet alongside this march into the future came a surprising turn toward the past. In 2018, the U.S. Army announced the revival of a classic, the pinks and green service uniform modeled after the dress uniforms of World War II. With olive drab jackets, taupe trousers, and brown leather shoes, the new service uniform deliberately evoked the era of the greatest generation. It was not combat attire, but ceremonial dress meant for parades, promotions, and formal occasions. Its message was clear: in times of uncertainty, America's Army wanted to root itself in tradition in the memory of its most celebrated victories. Soldiers themselves responded with pride. Wearing the pinks and greens connected them to the legacy of those who had stormed Normandy, liberated Europe, and stood against tyranny. The uniform reminded them and the public that they were heirs to a lineage of sacrifice stretching back centuries. But if the dress uniform looked to the past, the combat uniform looked relentlessly forward. Modern OCP fatigues were made with ripstop fabric, flame-resistant treatments, and Velcro patches for quick customization. Soldiers could adapt their look to mission requirements, rolling sleeves, adding armor plates, or attaching equipment. The uniform had become modular, a reflection of modern warfare's unpredictability. And yet amid this modernity, one duty remained timeless: the duty of remembrance. In Arlington National Cemetery, soldiers of the 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment, known as the Old Guard, have stood sentinel at the tomb of the unknown soldier since April 6, 1948. Their uniforms are not camouflage, but immaculate dark blue dress coats with gold trim polished shoes that gleam and white gloves crisp as snow. They march with measured precision, every step the same length, every turn exact. Rain, snow, or blazing sun, they never falter. Their duty is not to fight, but to honor. The tomb represents all those lost in battle, whose names are unknown, whose uniforms were left behind on fields far from home. The Old Guard's presence ensures that no sacrifice is forgotten, that every soldier's service, no matter how anonymous, is remembered with dignity. The contrast is striking. On one side, the camouflage-clad soldier in OCP bristling with modern gear fighting wars that are broadcast in real time across the world. On the other, the silent sentinel in dress blues guarding the remains of men whose identities vanished in the chaos of war. Both wear the uniform. Both carry its meaning. And that meaning has always been greater than the cloth. The uniform binds generations. It is the thread connecting the ragged coats of the Minutemen, the blue of the Revolution, the gray of the Civil War, the khaki of the doughboys, the olive drab of Normandy, the green fatigues of Vietnam, the desert camo of Iraq, and the OCP of today. Each generation of soldier inherits not only the fabric, but the memory. When a young recruit buttons his blouse or laces his boots, he joins a story centuries old. He wears not only what the Army issues him, but also the ghosts of Valley Forge, Gettysburg, Bastogne, Cassine, and Fallujah. The uniform makes him part of a lineage larger than himself. For families too, the uniform holds power. It is folded into coffins, preserved in closets, passed down as heirlooms. A jacket that once carried sweat and dust becomes decades later a sacred relic, smelling faintly of time and memory. Parents frame uniforms to honor sons and daughters lost in battle. Veterans keep their old boots, their old helmets, unable to throw them away because the fabric itself carries the weight of years. The modern uniform carries new burdens as well. After 2 decades of counterinsurgency wars, American society has sometimes struggled to connect with those who wear it. For many civilians, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan remained distant, abstract conflicts fought by a small percentage of the population. The uniform in airports and public spaces became both a marker of respect and a reminder of separation. "Thank you for your service" became a phrase worn thin by repetition, sincere, but often hollow. And yet, for the soldier, the uniform remains steady. It is the constant in a world of change, whether in Afghanistan's mountains, Iraq's deserts, or on humanitarian missions in distant lands. It is the garment they sweat and fight in and sometimes die in. Its meaning is shaped not by policy or politics, but by the bond of those who wear it together. As America moves deeper into the 21st century, the soldier's uniform continues to evolve. Smart fabrics, lightweight armor, integrated sensors, all are on the horizon. Tomorrow's soldier may wear cloth that tracks health helmets that project data boots that adjust automatically to terrain. And yet, no matter how advanced, the uniform will still carry the same old truth. It is not just what a soldier wears, it is who a soldier becomes. From the frozen huts of Valley Forge to the marble silence of Arlington, from the trenches of France to the deserts of Iraq, from the flamboyant zouaves to the pixelated ACUs, the story of the American soldier is written in cloth. And in that story lies a reminder. A uniform is never just fabric. It is a promise, a bond, a sacrifice. It is the thread that stitches a nation's past to its present and its present to its future.